Welcome. My name is David Sherman, and I'm the chair of the philosophy department. And it's really my great pleasure to kick off the festivities today. We're here, in some sense, to honor Albert Borgman, who is going to be giving the presentation now and will be delivering the Bugbee Lecture later tonight. I looked at Albert's CV, and I didn't realize that Albert next year, which will be his last year, will have been here 40 years at the time that he retires. And it is an incredibly august career that Albert has put behind him. He's been an indispensable part of the university community, and his involvement in matters large and small belie the fact that he's absolutely recognized as an international scholar, and in particular in the area of the philosophy of technology. Heidegger, from whom Albert takes certain cues, has a statement where he says something that we lose the nearest of the near. And in certain respects, we're all guilty of that, including us. We frequently deal with simply Albert, forgetting that Albert is a scholar of international repute. It's really my great pleasure to introduce him. Albert is someone who stuck out on his own path, and I think in this sense followed Henry Bugbee, for whom he will be delivering the lecture tonight, as someone who took what he thought was most important, most serious, and ran with it philosophically, and in the process put together a remarkable career. So, it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Professor Albert Borgman, who will be speaking now on the question of moral perfectionism and whether it's incompatible with democratic equality, and he will be speaking tonight at 8 o'clock in the Bugbee Lecture Series. So, thank you, Albert.
Thank you, David. What I would like to do this afternoon is discuss an aspect of John Rawls's theory of justice. And so I should begin by acknowledging my debt to my friend and colleague Tom Huff, who introduced me to John Rawls sometime in the early 70s. And Tom is a really fine Rawls scholar. But he's also the embodiment of Rawlsian justice. And I doubt Rawls and his philosophy would have made the impression on me that it did had it not been for Tom's scholarship and the way that he lived Rawlsian justice. Tom is more than the embodiment of Rawlsian justice, but it's not an easy thing to be. And Tom really pulled it off. So what I want to discuss is whether democratic equality, which is the sort of justice that John Rawls develops in his theory of justice, is compatible with perfectionism. To begin with democratic equality, it's the kind of justice that he articulates, develops, and supports in what I think is the greatest book in American philosophy, A Theory of Justice. And the wonderful thing about the theory is that it can be condensed into just two principles. And those two principles go on a 3x5 card. So if you think that embodying Rawlsian justice is a little steep, there's a handy alternative. You can carry it in your wallet. So here are the two principles. The first is called the equal liberties principle, and it says everyone is to have a maximum share of rights and liberties compatible with everyone else having that same share. And this is sometimes called the harm principle. It's really not contested. It's heavily emphasized by Rawls. But what's distinctive about Rawls is the second principle. And the second principle is called the difference principle. It's an inequality principle, and it tells us what kinds of inequalities are morally defensible. And as you know, we Americans are willing to accept certain inequalities, but not without limit. And the inequality should be based on some principle of fairness, as you have seen with the reaction to the bonuses that are coming or perhaps not coming to certain AIG executives. So what are the conditions that inequalities need to meet, according to Rawls? The first condition is that the positions and offices that are privileged with inequality must be open under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And that, too, more or less is something that we embrace, although the way Rawls develops is the conditions are much more stringent than we normally recognize. And so the really important Rawlsian and distinctive Rawlsian part is the second part of the second principle, the second condition that needs to be met if an inequality is to be morally defensible. And that it has to be to the advantage of the worst off. And that embodies the care, the compassion, well disguised under scholarship, that is so admirable about John Rawls. Now, the question that I want to discuss is whether perfectionism is compatible with democratic equality. And Rawls discusses that issue at some length in section 50 of the Theory of Justice. So what's perfectionism? It's not as daunting as it sounds. You don't have to be a perfectionist to support perfectionism. All you have to support is the pursuit of excellence. And again, it's the pursuit, not the attainment of excellence, that characterizes what philosophers call perfectionism. So the question is perfectionism acceptable as a policy, as a goal of public undertakings? Nobody opposes, the private pursuit of moral excellence. Perfectionists can get on your nerve, but normally we say, okay, you want to pursue excellence, go ahead. But the question is, should we, as a matter of politics, support the pursuit of excellence? So Rawls begins by distinguishing two kinds of perfectionism. The first I'll call radical, and the second, both Rawls and I call moderate. So what's radical perfectionism? Radical perfectionism says that the purpose of society and politics is to produce excellent human beings. And a proponent of that view is Nietzsche in the Unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen, Untimely Reflections, where he says it's the purpose of society to produce ever and again men of excellence. And he thinks of Socrates, he thinks of Goethe, and no doubt he thought of himself. The second kind of perfectionism also pursues human excellence, and that is, as Rawls says, the dedication of talented human beings in the causes of art, science, and culture. But in the moderate case, that pursuit is balanced by considerations of social justice. And so the question is either one acceptable to Rawls? And the answer is no. It's easy to see why Rawls would reject the first kind, because the first kind is single-minded in the pursuit of the production of talented people that are likely to achieve excellence, and everything else is subordinate to it, and including the exploitation of minorities and misery for large parts of the population and so on. And that, of course, is unacceptable to Rawls. He thinks that what he calls the coercive apparatus of the state should not be employed to push excellence. And in that section, in this part of Section 50, he does not deny that there are standards of excellence and that we're able to, distinguish the really first-rate people from the not-so-first-rate people. But for Rawls, the important consideration is not the human being as a talented human being, but as a moral agent. And a moral agent is a person who knows what he or she wants out of life and who has a sense of justice. And in that regard, we're all alike. And that consideration overrides any concerns that we may have regarding the pursuit of excellence. Rawls thinks that the pursuit of excellence should be left to voluntary organizations, voluntary associations. In the second instance, in the case of moderate perfectionism, Rawls concedes that it's more difficult to oppose and to reject, but reject it he nevertheless does. And the reason is that that he thinks that standards of excellence are always unsettled, idiosyncratic, ideological, and therefore if the state supports them, the state inevitably disadvantages others and therefore violates the first principle of justice, which is equal liberties, equal rights and liberties for everybody. The question then is, how do we respond to Rawls's rejection? And I will respond by first giving my agreement with Rawls, then enumerating some differences of opinion that I have with Rawls, and then finally outlining some disagreements. I used to think of Rawls as just being wrong and deficient in this regard. As I've gotten older, I have to think of it more as a division of labor, and I have recognized that every book has its limits, and you should, respect and honor the limits that a person sets himself or herself in whatever book the person writes. Nonetheless, there are some interesting misdirections, I think, in the way in which Rawls reaches the limits of his book. And and in particular, I think he is wrong in the rather limited way in which he assigns the pursuit of perfection, the place that he assigns the pursuit of perfection in society. He says that perfectionism can only be used instrumentally. That is, if the pursuit of perfection, that is, allowing certain talented people to develop their artistic abilities or their scientific abilities, then it has to serve the population at large. So these kind of excellences are not pursued in their own right, but rather as means towards some social advantage. The second condition under which perfectionism can be pursued is if it meets the Wicksell criterion of unanimity. So what's that? Wicksell was a Swedish economist who liked the idea that in business, decisions are made unanimously. So consider the people who bought Hummers as a class of people. They all made the same decision, and they made it unanimously. right? And that if you can have that, that's a nice thing. And so Wicksell thought, well, you know, paying taxes is like buying something, and you should not ask people to pay taxes unless you can get unanimity. And so he devised this process where you sort of try and narrow things on what people will unanimously agree a tax should be paid for, and once you have unanimity, well, then the tax is levied. And so if we want to support the theater or you know, the beauty of the environment or something like this, if we want to support an academy that serves particularly talented people, fine if you can get unanimity, which of course is to say you'll never get it. So what then are the points that I agree with on Rawls? And there are 2 points I think that are important that I agree with. The first is the what he calls the coercive machinery of the state should not be used in the pursuit of excellence. And the second one that I very much agree with is this, you may call it populism, this concern for everyone in our society, and especially the concern for those who most need our concern and support. I have differences of opinion on what he thinks of as the kind of excellence that we'll pursue in perfectionism. He thinks primarily of what philosophers would call non-moral human excellences. So what's a non-moral excellence? It's an excellence that is not subject to your will. So moral excellences are moral excellences that are up to you, like honesty or generosity. So if you're dishonest, that's your fault. You could be honest, you just don't want to. Or you could be generous, and if you're not, again, it's your fault. But if you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer, it's not your fault. You can't make yourself much more intelligent than you are. And if you're not, the most attractive person in the room, that's not your fault either. You can't make yourself much more beautiful or handsome than you are. So these are non-moral excellences. And they're human in that when Rawls talks about excellence, he always has in mind the excellence of the person, the artist, the composer, the scientist, much more than the object of the person's pursuit. That's why I call them human excellences. If you talk about the excellence in science, what is it that you really admire and are after? Well, it can either be primarily the great new scientific theory that explains something that hitherto was hazy or unexplained, or you can admire and strive for people who are able to do it. You admire, their intelligence, their persistence, their ingenuity. And in Rawls, the emphasis always falls on the human side rather than what we may call the real side, the object of the excellence. So this is going to sound a little too artsy by half. But the idea is this: while Rawls champions non-moral human excellences, we should also champion moral human excellences and non-moral real excellences. And these are just, as I said, differences of the point of view of emphasis. I don't think Rawls would disagree. In fact, there are certain moral excellences, certain moral human excellences that he very much emphasizes, and those are the ones that are part of the sense of justice. So these are the virtues of being reasonable, tolerant, willing to negotiate, willing to strike compromises, and so on. And the major point is, apart from the moral excellences that are part of the sense of justice, he would reject the other kinds of excellences anyway. Next, then, is the question where I disagree with Rawls. And I have 4 disagreements. The first is about people. The second is about reality. The third is about the state. And the fourth is about standards of excellence. Okay, first about people. On each of these 4, I think Rawls makes some unwarranted assumptions. So the first assumption regarding people is that people choose what he calls the good. And the good is their conception of what makes life worthwhile. And Rawls is very emphatic that the individual is the judge and the chooser and the decider regarding his or her good. As regards reality, Rawls thinks that we can have stuff, real stuff out there, that's value neutral, that will serve whatever goal the person, under the first consideration, chooses as his or her conception of what makes life worthwhile. As regards the state, Rawls, I think, is wrong in thinking that the state acts on people in one of 2 ways. Either coercively, by forcing people to do something, and of course the state does when it comes to speed limits and paying taxes and abiding by zoning laws and so on. Or the state is neutral. So the state creates all kinds of things as undertakings, but they do not force people's hand. They can be used this way or that way. They're all-purpose means, he sometimes calls them. And the technical term that he uses is primary social goods. Primary in the sense that they're basic, and social because they're within the authority of the state. And then finally, as regards standards of excellence, as I said, Rawls thinks that standards of excellence are inevitably controversial, ideological, and unsettled. Now, as regards those standards, you have to agree with Rawls on one point, and that is that people sometimes reach for standards of excellence in the pursuit of political goals where the principles of justice don't help them anymore. They want to push something, and the resort to the principles of justice is not going to support them. So the example that Rawls uses is sexual relations. And obviously he doesn't mention this, and this was written in he wrote his book in 72, something like this. And then, of course, it was evident to enlightened people that sexual relations should not be legislated or should be restricted by legislation. But at any rate, the Rawlsian point is that people who oppose certain kinds of sexual relations, and as I said, he must have had homosexual relations in mind, are unable to press their cause for the criminalization or at least restriction of sexual relations, or the lack of recognizing them as falling under marriage. They don't find support among the principles of justice, so they reach for a standard of excellence, and often they do so by saying that it's for the good of the people that we're doing this, right? And that's the fundamentalist notion that homosexuality is some sort of ailment, some sort of miscarriage of human nature. And so if we force them to abstain, we would be doing a good thing for them. So I think this points out well that standards of excellence are often abused. And then, of course, that also illustrates the point that I made earlier, that bringing the coercive apparatus of the state to bear on an issue like this is clearly unacceptable. Okay, I now turn to the reasons why I disagree on each of these assumptions that Rawls makes, tacitly in some cases, explicitly in others. So the first assumption, as I said, is that Rawls assumes that people choose their good, that is, their conception of what a worthwhile life is. And my reply is that people don't choose. A lot of people just do not choose. They go with the flow. They don't make a choice of a substantial kind, either in shaping their life, nor do they make one in their daily decisions. Rather, there is something like a default behavior in our society that is, as I will point out in the discussion of reality, that channels people's behavior in a certain way. And unless we're blessed with extraordinary talents or circumstances, we just go with the flow. We engage in that default behavior. So my first disagreement is a lot of people don't decide. The second is certain people do decide, but they decide in the wrong way. So assume a person decides one fine New Year's Eve to become physically more active. And then the question is one of implementation. How do you implement that decision? And you can do it in one of two ways. You can entrust your decision to daily implementation or to what I call a fundamental implementation. What's daily implementation? Well, that's sort of the vague idea, every day I'm just going to go out there and walk, or go to the gym or whatever. If I feel like it, if the circumstances are right, and so on. And as you all know, that just doesn't happen. The person says, this coming year, I'm going to read Shakespeare. I mean, I'm really ashamed. I haven't read one play by Shakespeare. I'm going to release 5 of them, right? So the person buys the collected works of Shakespeare and has the idea, I'm going to sit by the fire and read Shakespeare. And that doesn't happen either. So what's a fundamental decision? A fundamental decision is sometimes called a self-binding decision, where you decide on some agreement that has some force beyond your daily decisions. So in the case of Shakespeare, you take a Molly course, or better yet, you register and pay your tuition and take a Shakespeare course. And then in some way you bind yourself for that semester. There are expectations that are going to show up, that you do the homework. Not that fundamental decisions are inescapable, but they have a stronger force. And in the case where you want to do more exercising, you join, or better yet, you put together a group of hikers and you say, every Wednesday morning, come hell or high water, we're going to meet at the Grizzly sculpture and we're going to take, a 2-hour walk. And that's a fundamental decision in that you, agree, you make promises, you're expected, your trust, your word is at issue, And so you're bound in a more definite way. Well, so the second problem is even people who decide often decide in this inept way by making a decision and then entrusting it to daily implementation, which is to just, give up on it. Okay, third, there are people who decide and they're trying to do it in a fundamental way, but the culture gets in their way. They have to do it against the culture, or at least in the teeth of the culture. So if you live in one of those distended suburbs that have no park, no sidewalks, it's just uninviting. And there's something sort of stupid, to go out there where all the cars are whizzing back and forth and to run. You have to be foolish. So the entire automotive culture, the lack of inviting staircases, gets in the way of your wanting to be physically more active or take intimacy with nature. So you may have your favorite fishing spot, and then one fine day you find, that there is a development and it is no more. So in many ways, we're working, even when we're clear-sighted about the kind of excellence that we want to pursue, against what the culture presents to us. And so you can see how these four considerations hang together, because the second, now turning to reality, is that Rawls is wrong in thinking that there can ever be sort of value-neutral, tangible institutions in society. They're always skewed or biased in some way. And I think what sort of came to Rawls's aid, well, there are two things, I think. One, he was misled by his students, and my students have learned to call this the Harvard professor blind spot. You find it in many versions, and it is that, Rawls looks around and, boy, there are all these high achievers, and, why did they get into Harvard? Because, one is a piano prodigy, and the other, has run a 4-minute mile, and the third one, is a star football player, and a fourth one has already produced and staged a play. So yeah, these people, they have chosen a pursuit of excellence, so not to worry about it. And the second is that the consumer society, of course, in some sense gives us value-neutral choices, and the embodiment is the supermarket. Right? So in the supermarket, it's not that everything is geared towards Mexican food, and you just find yourself buying Mexican food all the time. No, you can buy American and Italian and French and whatever you like. So and the consumer society, generally speaking, is value neutral at that level. But of course, the consumer society itself represents a stark and significant choice that has, great consequences for the general mental and physical well-being of people. So the idea, that we can have this sort of fit between the freely choosing individual and a value-neutral availability of means, I think is just mistaken. And that then brings me to the third point, and that is the point that the state acts on people either coercively or by way of inducements. And these inducements are powerful in one sense, but they're not coercive. Right? So if you, during the summer, don't want to go shopping for produce at Albertsons, you don't have to. The state is not coercive in pushing the consumer society. No one knocks on your door, and sees to it that you're really sitting on your couch watching television and drinking beer. You don't have to. You can play your instrument, you can go out running in the park. But the fact that most people don't shows that the way that we have put society together, the tangible arrangements of society together, have a heavily conducive force. As you know, just recently, the government saw to it that the airwaves are being digitized, right? That the analog use of the spectrum has been, or will soon be discontinued. And if you go to the federal website, it's explained, that this will lead to greater prosperity and flowering of human excellence and so on. But as you know, what has happened over the last 40 years when it comes to television is, to be sure, a greater array of choices, but not sort of a rising level of excellence in the use of television. And the government is implicit in pushing this. And as you know, the government now is from the standpoint of a president, I think, who has a fine sense, and in fact, in many ways is the embodiment of excellence, is in the unenviable position to have to force people, induce them, make them do what's really not good for them, consume more. Right? And of course, the idea is, let's get that car going, and then we'll steer it in a new direction. That's the hope, and I support it. I don't think if the engine isn't working, you're not going to get people to push the car in the right direction. It's got to work. Nonetheless, what that shows how the government in so many ways is an accomplice in the culture that we have. And, but these are primarily economic measures that are what the government takes a hand in streamlining and inventing. Just think of the internet and how it has transformed personal relations, relations with businesses. Well, where did it come from? DARPA, right? A government agency created it. And of course, there's always this, to my mind, strange, if not unconscionable, ignorance of the tendencies that are built into the things that the government supports through DARPA, through the digitizing of the electromagnetic spectrum. Finally, standards. Are the standards of excellence really as controversial as they're made out to be? Well, some are controversial, and they should be rejected, such as the fundamentalist views on homosexuality, the fundamentalist rejection of marriage as a way of recognizing homosexual relations. But there are others that cut across this and that are not really in question. The reason why many of us think they're controversial is because as soon as the notion of excellence is raised, we take a defensive posture because we know that we have not met the claims of excellence. And so we say, look, if you want to be courageous, if you want to be wise, if you want to be a great friend, go ahead. But I'm just going to, look what my PDA is telling me. Or You know, I'm going to watch television tonight. We all have failed. And so the maneuver is really this. We're not saying courage is a bad thing, and so is wisdom, and knowledge is a bad thing, you know, yay for ignorance. We say, hey, it's just not on the agenda. It's none of your business. Leave me alone. So what you have to do is get people out of their defensive posture into the selfless, benevolent position. And how do you do that? You invite them to take the parental position, right? And to imagine that they're looking at their child, and then you say, what would you like her to be? What sort of a person would you like her to be? And when you say, would you want her to be knowledgeable, physically confident and active, a reliable and loyal friend, steeped and skilled in the arts and letters? Would any parent say, hey, not my kid. I want her to be stupid, awkward, solitary, you know, and banausic when it comes to the arts? No. Everybody would say, yeah, yeah. And it's hard to imagine that someone would disagree, except philosophers, of course. They always disagree. But ordinary people, I think, would say, yeah. So I don't think these sort of very basic virtues are really in question. And so then the question is, how do we act on all this? And of course, the idea is that the first thing is to engender, to the extent that we can, an awareness and a discussion of what the pursuit of excellence and perfectionism entails. And then the idea, of course, is to get a consensus, at least, that the way that we have put the tangible environment together is not conducive to the pursuit of excellence, and that we should reshape it so that it is. And in that way, I think democratic equality and perfectionism can be joined. In fact, they must be joined. Because if democratic equality does not recognize that everyone is capable of the pursuit of excellence, and everyone should be invited into it in